Greetings great guys, and welcome back to What If Goku Was an Avatar. This is part 5, but before we continue, let's just do a quick recap of what happened in the last part. So the three siblings were separated from Aang in the newly refurbished chamber back in Amashu. The whole point of them being taken was of course to motivate Aang, or use as leverage should he decide to not participate in the 3 deadly challenges. But if you remember, Toku broke free from the crystal and challenged Bumi head on, and his soldiers. They then had a fight, and it sort of ended in a draw. Kind of. Toki used his fire beam, and this stopped the fight. Bumi then released Sokka and Katara and came clean with the group. We then didn't cover Haru, Heibai, or Roku, as the timeline was completely different, and the gang would not have been in the same place as the original. They did however meet up with Bato, with the main change there being that they never fell out with Aang. They never got annoyed because he never hid the letter from Hakoda. Another event that almost stayed the same was the Jongjong saga. Well, it went quite differently, but it still happened, that's what I mean. The difference was that Aang and Toku were both promised fire lessons from the master, and Aang stayed more patient, due to Toku staying calm. The final thing that took place in the last parts was that Toku discovered how Ki worked a bit more, and he was able to do stuff others thought might have been energy bending? Now that we were all caught up, let's continue with part 5. I do remember saying in the last part that Admiral Zhao would still be arriving, just a little later. Well, just the gang's luck, that time is soon. Now, why would he be late to begin with? Well, because Zuko and his crew hadn't been tailgating Aang like in the original, Zhao didn't have to be as on top of things. He was less stressed and didn't really consider Prince Zuko as competition in the same way. After all, he could take him, or so he thought. Oh, I know that part wasn't told in the earlier what-ifs, so let's just cover that real quick. Zhao beat Zuko in the Agni Kai. This is because Zuko was still a little bit injured from before when Toku tossed him down from the ship. Don't worry, he didn't get his other side all burnt. I'm gonna say that Iroh stepped in before, which Zuko didn't like, but also sort of was grateful for as he didn't want the other side burnt, but he would never admit that. Anyway, back to the story. Toku had just discovered that he could do quite a lot of new things with his energy bending, and was stoked. I know that the original Goku mostly just spammed his Kamehameha wave and used his limbs, head, teeth, anything really. But Toku in my what if has grown up in a world where bending is the more common way to battle for all benders, and so it would be quite natural for him to keep exploring and sort of experimenting with his energy just the same way someone with bending would experiment with their element. I simply don't see him here staying limited and spamming his one and only fire attack. He'd of course still like martial arts, or fighting / battling as he called it, because that's what he practiced with his father and Sokka. Hand-to-hand combat will always be a part of him. Some days went by, and Aang was getting pretty good at his firebending. He was no master yet of course, but I do seem to remember him learning quite quickly in the original. The only problem was that he got scared after having burnt Katara, but here, that never happened. Jongjong and Toku were there to ensure that the practice went smoothly. Sure, Aang didn't have the important knowledge of the other elements that Jongjong so preached about, but Jongjong was still there to remind him to take things easy, to not treat firebending the same way he had treated airbending.
Remember, you cannot unring a bell. Once you have struck your blow, the fire will burn on, unless you take control.
Yeah, he's right, Aang. I've gotten carried away many times. Good thing my surroundings were almost always ice.
Aang took their words to heart, and the training was going really well, but suddenly, one of the people in Jongjong's camp interrupted the training. He was carrying bad news. Apparently, a small Fire Nation boat, or 3 of them, were heading down the river, and would be arriving very shortly. You guessed it, Admiral Zhao, was almost there. And it wasn't to take part in Jongjong's lesson, but rather to try and teach them a lesson. Having heard this, Jongjong tried to get the gang to leave, stating that they were after them.
Go now, or you'll all be destroyed.
But as we know, running away from invaders is not really Toku's style. Also, Aang would want to help. He did in the original, and that was without Toku there. Now, because both of the 12-year-olds were so keen on staying and fighting, I think Sokka and Katara, albeit a bit reluctantly, would also choose to stay and join in the fight, much to Jongjong's dismay. Originally, we know that the whole camp kind of fled. This is because he's a sort of pacifist, isn't he? And doesn't take joy in battle. But because Aang and especially Toku were hell-bent on staying and stopping the attackers in order to be able to continue their training with Zhong, I feel like he'd feel forced to stay.
I see something! There!
Exclaimed Sokka. And sure enough, something was closing in. It was Admiral Zhao, on a boat, followed by 2 more boats. Sokka took a good look at them and concluded that there were 5 non-benders with spears and 4 firebenders, including Zhao.
Nice catch, Sokka! This should be easy enough.
Judging by the fact that Aang could kind of toy with Zhao in the original, plus we know that most of the average firebender soldiers are basically useless, I'm going to say that this was definitely not a fair fight. But even so, this didn't turn into anything gory. Once Zhong had raised some firewalls, not the computer ones, in order to divide and stop the intruders, and the rest of the gang had gone on the attack, Zhao and his little crew did not last long. First taken down were the non-bending spear soldiers. They were handled by Sokka and Katara. Yeah, challenging a waterbender by a river without being a bender and only having 1 spear each. A spear that can be dropped, snapped, and well, let's just say the odds aren't in your favour. As for the last 4, just a few scare attacks from Toku would be enough to scare them off, but let's just say that they didn't flee quite yet. We'll give them a few more moments. So, a minute went by, and well, that's all I give them. And suddenly, Zhao found himself standing alone, facing his old firemaster, the Avatar, some weird kid with a yellow, god knows what that was, bending, a waterbender, and a boy with a boomerang who seemed to know how to use it. Oh, and also any other camp member who might have been present. Anyway, all of his men were now taken down or cowering. At this point, Zhao knew he was outmatched and outnumbered, but Admiral Zhao being Admiral Zhao, tried to attack them anyway. He settled for a massive fireball. Aang and Toku were able to slow down and shrink the attack using their own firebending as well as ki control, which pleased Zhong. His teachings about control and defense seemed to have paid off. They might have done this anyway, but Zhong thought at least it had paid off. Zhao, after having seen his own attack be neutralized by the youngest people there, he had no choice but to surrender. Well, kind of. His pride didn't allow him to say, "I give up," but his actions were kind of clear. He tried to create as much steam as possible by boiling the water below, and then set off with all his men, with the gang yelling from behind,
"See you later, Admiral!"
Oh, the shame! The newly promoted Admiral running from some kids. No, this didn't happen. Nobody would ever know about this, and they certainly had not seen the last of Admiral Zhao. Back at the camp, everybody was cheering. Everybody except for Zhong.
You must leave. Now!
What are you talking about? We just kicked their butts!
You may have won this fight, but the war is not over.
The gang looked at him, a bit confused, but still with smirks on their faces.
He may not be much of a threat on his own, but he is an admiral, and he has many more ships and men at his disposal. Now he knows where you are hiding, and if you stay, an ambush is sure to occur.
But what about your teachings?
It is more important that the Avatar get to the Northern Water Tribe. That was your plan before you found me. We will be leaving the camp anyway.
But how will I find you again? I've yet to master firebending.
Listen, you have shown me the last few days, especially today, that you know enough and understand the dangers of fire, and not to burn down your surroundings or hurt those closest to you. Now, you will continue with water and earthbending, and one day, perhaps we will meet again. Until then, focus on your waterbending.
Aang nodded, but looked a bit disappointed.
I'm not saying you can't practice firebending, but make water your priority. You have a great raw power within. Just remember your training. Now go!
Aang and Katara did a courteous bow towards Zhong, while Toku and Sokka just stood next to them, smiling. They all thanked him and got onto Appa, then flew away. Normally, what would follow next after this is episode 17, which is the one where they go to the Northern Air Temple and met all these fake airbenders, but that won't happen. The reason is that the original 3-member gang only went there after having heard about the flying men from an old traveller telling stories around a campfire. But because the odds are very slim that they'd run into that same old geezer in this timeline, with all the changes that's been, they never ended catching word of this and never went to the Air Temple. Remember this information, because it would change quite a lot down the line. Sokka, together with Tio's dad, the mechanist or whatever it was called, did great things together. The war balloon and the submarine, for instance. Anyway, instead of that trip, I'm just going to say that the gang went elsewhere. More camping, barbecuing, and practicing. Perhaps not so much swimming, as they were getting pretty close to the Northern Water Tribe, so it would be a bit cold for that. Now I know we've skipped a lot of episodes like the Waterbender Scroll and the Blue Spirit, but I can't have every single moment in this What If, or it's going to take like a year before we get to Master Paku. After a few more weeks of flying, the four of them had finally reached terrain that looked like home. Well, at least to the siblings. There was water beneath them and icebergs all around.
We must be getting close.
The four of them looked at each other with joy. Sokka and Toku almost with tears in their eyes, thinking about all the food they'd be able to eat. But suddenly, they got splashed with a massive wave. They were then frozen in place, but not for long. Once the northern waterbenders realised that the intruders were in fact their sister tribe, they melted the ice around Appa and guided them to the great city of ice. They were all welcomed and treated almost like royalty, dining next to the princess. Of course, they were a little bit taken back when they saw Toku scoff his food, but ultimately they turned a blind eye to his poor manners. He was probably just starving from his journey. Yeah, that must have been it. After dinner, Aang was introduced to Master Paku, where he learned of his snobbish attitude. Nevertheless, it was agreed that he'd teach him as well as Aang's friend, who Paku didn't know was a girl. Toku did not join in, however, as they all now believed him to be an energy bender, and didn't really think there'd be much point in a water master teaching him. Paku's time would be better spent on actual waterbenders. Also, the gang thought at least, so Toku joined Sokka. This meant that the meeting with Aang, Katara and the Master still went the same. Aang got to train with him, while Katara was sent to the healing huts. Oh, by the way, I know I said that Toku went with Sokka, but this doesn't mean that he acted as a third wheel with Sokka and Princess Yue, spoiling their, romantic interaction? No, not at all. In fact, Yue was kind of out of the picture altogether here. Why? Well, if we remember back to when they went to Kyoshi Island, they stayed there a bit longer than in the original, and Sokka clicked with Suki a lot quicker. So, here, even a few months ahead, he's still got Suki on his mind. As a result of this, the two brothers just spent the next couple of days walking around and exploring the place, comparing it to home. Things here were indeed very different, as were the people. The weirdest part was probably that everybody didn't know everybody, like they did back in their own village, if you can even call it that. Anyway, let's do a little time skip here, as 1. The gang were a bit early to the North Pole and we have time to kill, and 2. Things for Aang and Katara went very similar to the original. Sure, Toku wanted to stand up for Katara when Paku turned her down, but Katara is rather independent and wanted to challenge the old fool herself. So we still get that scene where they fight and she loses because she didn't want Toku's aid. But then Paku finds out that the siblings are his old love's grandkids, and so let Katara train with him. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's move on. I'm going to say that the Fire Nation attacked the Water Tribe more or less the same time they did in the original, though Iroh and Zuko didn't join Admiral Zhao. They were in slightly different places in my What If, and I think Zhao and his battle fleet would have done this siege without Zuko's crew, having not found them. The ocean is a big place after all, and it could have taken forever. Now Zuko still wanted to catch Aang, of course, but how could he possibly have known exactly where Aang was at the moment? It's not like Zhao would have sent him a private letter saying, "Hey Prince Zuko, the Avatar is in the Northern Water Tribe. Last one there is a rotten fish. Admiral Zhao." I'm sorry to say, Zuko will miss out on this one. Zhao would of course have wanted Iroh's help, but not knowing where he was and also knowing that Zuko was still alive, and therefore Iroh would side with Zuko, I just don't see them joining him. Back to the Water Tribe. I know there was a full moon in the attack in the original, and since the siege now is scheduled to happen pretty much the same time as the original too, there will be a full moon in my What If as well. And a full moon where Toku is awake and walking out in the open. I know it looked like there was a full moon for many days in the original Avatar, but that's just because it kind of looks like a full moon even when the moon's at like 95% fullness. Though I believe the Saiyans only transform at 100% moon fullness, or with an artificially made one. So like one day. So here there will only be one day that he transforms, of course. And that day is the actual day of invasion. Here, Sokka was never tasked to watch over Jue because he never got that close to her. Instead, her husband-to-be got that job. Instead, Sokka focused more on preparing to battle the Fire Nation soldiers together with Toku. Aang still hadn't been able to get into the spirit world yet, but he did know of it by now, and that he had to make contact with it to get help from previous avatars or Someone at least. I think either Gyatso, Bumi, Jongjong or Paku would have mentioned something about him needing to get to the spirit world at some point to get the help he needs, but he didn't know how to, and of course they wouldn't know how to guide him in there. This is where Princess Jue, or Princess Jue, don't really know how to pronounce her name, stepped up. She mentioned the sacred, most spiritual place in the whole Northern Water Tribe, and that place was the place to meditate, if anywhere. Though here, we don't get Zuko show up during Aang's meditation, so he just continued to meditate safely, while Katara and Yue, or Jesus, her name's weird, with them by his side, just watching over. Eventually, the Fire Nation actually made it inside the walls, and the battle started, for real. Sokka and Toku worked great together and took down many soldiers. They were of course very shocked by Toku's abilities. He could blast stuff, push them away, catch them in keychains or key handcuffs, like Gotenks and Vegeta have shown to do in the past. And to make matters worse, he was simply just a freak of nature, definitely the first boy they had ever seen who could lift and toss their tanks with his bare hands. The Water Tribe sure was glad to have him on their side. Now, the other Water Tribe warriors also did well, and the Fire Nation soldiers were being pushed back, and when the Fire Nation thought that things couldn't get much worse, and the young boy any stranger than he already was, they did. Toku had suddenly stopped. He was standing, gazing up towards the moon.
Hey Toku, I know we're kicking butts, but that's no reason to just lay back. This is war!
But Toku wasn't listening, and not until his coat ripped open and his eyes turned red did Sokka realise what was happening. He had seen this once before, but that was many years ago. It had been so long he had almost forgotten about that last incident. Well, not forgotten, it's kind of hard to forget a thing like that, but it had certainly not been on his mind during the battle, that's for sure. The siblings had kind of avoided the full moon all these years, but not really thought so much about why. I mean, they knew if they thought about it, but by now it was more of a habit really. And also, they were so young when Hakoda told them that it would be best for Toku to stay away from such spiritual circumstances. So Sokka could have also remembered things slightly wrong. But now, with it happening all over again, right in front of his eyes, not even the ongoing fight could distract Sokka from his memories rushing back. Quickly, he warned all the Water Tribe people to stand back, as they hadn't noticed Toku changing yet, and a few moments later, they all found themselves facing a massive gorilla the size of a large warship. And to find out what happens next, you'll have to wait for part 6.